Today I'm going to show you how I spent $500 on materials to make a table that I sold for $6,000. I don't do a lot of custom commissions, but every once in a while I like to take on the challenge. And in this case, I wanted to show how with a few simple design ideas, you can transform relatively inexpensive materials into a lucrative commission. The client wanted a very large dining table between 9 and 10 feet long, so I immediately thought that steel would be a good choice for the base. I cut some pieces of 3/4 inch thick plywood to make two templates that would help me keep the steel legs level. I'm going to weld the steel together while the legs are upside down, so I screwed together some 2x3s that I could attach to the plywood templates to hold them upright. These templates don't have to be pretty, so I was just using random pieces of material that I had lying around. I did want them to be as similar in shape and size as possible, so that's why I cut both of them at the same time, stacked on top of each other. The majority of the base is going to be made out of solid 1/2 inch diameter steel bars. I cut some notches in them with my angle grinder so that I could bend them to take the form of the V's that I cut into the plywood templates. It took a couple tries to remove enough material to get the bars to bend easily. I then marked the locations of where I needed to cut the next notches so I could bend the bars to create the feet for the table. I then trimmed the bars about 1 inch past these notches. The steel bar kept falling off the plywood, so I drilled some holes through the plywood templates so I could use my squeezy clamps to hold it in place. I need 2 sets of legs, so that's why I made 2 templates, and I'm not too worried because both of these templates are the exact same height. I cut some short pieces of 1/4 inch thick flat bar so that I can make some plates that I'm going to use to attach the legs to the tabletop. I then cut a bunch of lengths of the 1/2 inch rod, which will serve as the first part of the table legs. I put a flap disc on my angle grinder and then brushed off the mill scale to get this steel rod ready for welding. I clamped the clean metal into place and then slid the steel plates right under the plywood template. Now I just have to hold the rod still and then tack weld them together. Steel can move on you a little bit during the welding process, so that's why I went really light with the tacks first, just to check and make sure everything looked relatively symmetrical, and then I went back in with the welder and secured them a little bit more. I also used the welder to reinforce the V-shaped bars in the locations where I had cut it to make it easy to bend. I then tacked on the first of 2 middle rods and then added diagonal rods that will connect the 1/4 inch thick plates together. With both the middle and the outside rods in place, now I just need to space the additional rods at even increments. And I just use those same 2x3 L braces as guides. I'm just taking rough field measurements and then marking the lengths with a Sharpie. I'm also leaving the rods about 1/2 inch to 1 inch too long because I'm just going to go in afterwards and trim them all. Rough wood templates like this aren't perfect, and I probably had about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch margin for error on these, but at the size of this table, it'll be very difficult to pick up those inconsistency with the naked eye. The first half of the first leg went smoothly, so I just brushed out the welds and then went back and reinforced them a little more. I repeated the same process on the other side and started to go faster as I became more comfortable with this process. I'm using my Forney multi-process welder, which is the machine I highly recommend to beginners. It's just about $400, but it can do all 3 types of welding: MIG, stick, and TIG. I have made a ton of furniture projects using this machine, and it was the only welding machine that I used on the shipping container house. The plywood template got trapped inside this steel structure, so I just drilled a bunch of holes around the corners to loosen it up, and then got out my reciprocating saw and cut it into pieces. I used my angle grinder to trim down the rods, and then switched back to a flap disc and rounded them over nice and smooth. After all this grinding, I could see a few spots that weren't quite fully welded together, so I just went back in one more time with the Forney and really laid in some nice heavy beads. I flipped the structure over and then repeated these steps again, this time from a different angle. I want these structures to act as a rigid cage, so I'm just ensuring that each connection is nice and solid. I then drilled some 1/4 inch diameter holes through the steel plate that I'll use to pass screws through and fasten these legs to the underside of the tabletop. Now everything felt really strong, but I've learned from previous projects that it makes sense to test it before you paint it. So I screwed on some 2x6s and was very happy to see that the only thing that was flexing were the wooden 2x6s themselves. I did a final pass with the angle grinder and a flap disc just to make sure there were no sharp edges. I then switched to a wire brush and cleaned all of the steel to get it ready for paint. Now before I put on the primer, I wiped it all down with some acetone and then painted it with 2 coats of Rust-oleum Rusty Metal Primer. This is my go-to primer. I've had great results with it, and I'm just going to keep using it over and over again. For the paint itself, I'm using Rust-oleum Protective Enamel in gloss white. For the tabletop, I'm going to use white maple plywood. Now this is a very premium plywood. It has 13 different veneers in each 3/4 inch thick layer, and it costs about $120 for each 4x8 foot sheet. I'll get into the reasons why I selected this particular type of plywood in the design notes section at the end of this video. For a tabletop with a finished size of 9.5 feet long and about 42 inches wide, I'm going to need to seam together the pieces of plywood. So for the top layer that we'll be showing, I had to decide between whether I wanted fewer seams and an asymmetrical look or a symmetrical appearance with more seams, and I picked this second choice. Basically, I'm going to laminate 2 full layers of this 3/4 inch plywood and then add a 3rd layer just around the perimeter, which will bring the edge thickness of the tabletop to 2¼ inches thick. I made all the cuts with my Ryobi circular saw using a straight edge clamped down with some squeeze clamps to guide it. The middle layer is going to be made out of just 2 pieces of plywood, and I started by laying that out. I then checked the fit for the top 4 pieces just to make sure everything was lined up and my cuts were nice and straight before applying the glue and clamping these 2 layers together. I made sure to spread the glue very evenly and worked it all the way out to all the edges because I want a really good lamination on this giant table. The squeeze clamps are great for applying pressure around the perimeter, but I had to come up with a way to put some pressure on the center of the tabletop. So I laid out some rags and then put some scrap pieces of wood on top of them before using some longer pieces of scrap to act as bridges so that I could clamp to the edges but put pressure on the scrap pieces on top of the rags. I let the glue sit overnight, then removed the clamps and flipped the tabletop over. I had a little bit of an overlap on one of the ends, so I just trimmed both layers at once using the circular saw. I then cut some 3-inch wide strips of the plywood and glued and screwed them down around the perimeter of the table. This is just going to give me a little more stiffness, and it's going to hide the edges of the steel plates. I brought in the legs and screwed them down using 1¼ inch long screws. The table's pretty heavy, but I was still able to flip it over by myself, and then I just took some wood putty and filled in the seams in between the top panels. I wanted a soft edge just in case you bumped your hips against the table, so I used a 1/4 inch roundover bit on my palm router just to soften up the edges a little. This plywood is pretty hard and dense, so it took a while to sand, but I started with 120 grit and worked my way up to 220 and got nice, clean, smooth edges. I sanded down the wood putty using my orbital sander and 220 grit sandpaper. To seal the table, I used Varathane, water-based polyurethane, and crystal clear matte. This is a great low VOC finish that still provides a ton of protection. After letting the first coat completely cure, I then sanded it smooth with 320 grit sandpaper, wiped off the dust, and then applied a second coat. The table is super sturdy, has zero wobble to it, and all 4 feet were firmly on the ground, although a little bit of that probably had to do with the flex in the tabletop. That being said though, the tabletop doesn't wobble because of that flex. The weight of it keeps it all very secure and stable. I designed the legs so that chairs fit around it evenly on both the sides and the ends of the table. The seams on the top do show, but at least they're in a nice symmetrical pattern, and the client was fine with them. I'm really happy with the design. It's a fantastic table for a big family to come around during Thanksgiving. And it probably even would be a great conference room table as well. I definitely want to do a smaller version of these tables, and I'm even talking to the guys at DIY Hairpin Legs about making a set of these legs to sell. But let's head over to the studio where you can break down the design and talk about different options. All right, on this episode of Design Notes, I'm going to go over how I priced this commission, a little bit of the thinking behind the material choices, and some other design options that I considered. Now it's interesting to note that there's a lot of affordable options for dining tables that are medium sized, but once you get over 9 feet in size, the prices start to go up dramatically. Now I don't do a lot of custom commissions, but when I do, I always ask the client what other options they were considering if they weren't going to hire me. This way I get a sense of their price expectations and also about the different designs that they are attracted to. Custom commissions are all about setting expectations, and this is an easy, quick way to get an understanding of what they're looking for. This client was considering options from Restoration Hardware, Design Within Reach, and Room and Board. Now, the Restoration Hardware options were definitely nice sized tables. There was a 10-footer that was about $7,000 and a 9-footer that was around $6,000. But design-wise, they weren't exactly what the client was looking for. They were just a little bit too rustic and sumptuous and not quite as clean and modern as the products from Design Within Reach. The problem with the Design Within Reach tables is that they tended to be on the smaller side and they were pretty expensive for those sizes. Now, Room and Board is a great company that has a lot of basic options, but their 10-footer wasn't that exciting. It was just kind of flat. It was very reasonably priced. And what the client sort of wanted was something that looked a little bit more like something that would come from Design Within Reach, that was the size of the Restoration Hardware table, but not as boring as the Room and Board one. So that was the sort of goal for the commission. So we settled on a price of $6,000 for a table that was going to be about 9'6". As for the material choices, steel is relatively inexpensive. The 20-foot half-inch round bars that I got were only $9 each. And I bought 7 of them, but really only needed about 6.5. I used about 4 feet of flat bar, and if you were to get that from the scrap bin, it would cost you around 15 to 20 bucks. The maple plywood was pretty expensive as far as plywood goes. It's really high quality, but it's about $120 for a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet. Now, of course, there's also a whole bunch of consumables, sandpaper, wood glue, the Varathane, the spray paint, the welding wire and all that. But all in all the materials for this project were less than $500. Now, originally I suggested using a really nice hardwood solid slab, like the one I did for the table I made for Gary V. This was the project that the client originally saw when they requested me to come up with a design for them. But the client also has 2 small children that love to use the table as an art station. So the idea of getting a really expensive one-of-a-kind slab of hardwood that a couple of 8 and 9-year-olds might be sort of finger painting on and stuff like that didn't seem like the right fit. So what we decided was to make a very simple, reasonably affordable tabletop for now, and then maybe when the kids get older, if they want to replace it with a one-of-a-kind slab of hardwood, they can just unscrew the steel bases and then just buy the slab, finish it, and to screw them back on. So we're kind of really thinking about the whole life cycle of the table, and we don't want to put all this money into this $2,000 slab that is then going to have crayons and finger paint all over it. So I kind of like this way of thinking about things over the lifespan of a family. Now for other design options. Now, I'm not going to lie, I don't think having the exposed seams is ideal. I asked the client if they wanted me to do some sort of graphic design and use some heavy duty enamel paint that covers up the seams and makes the table a little bit more graphic, and then do the clear coat over that. I also considered routing out a 1 inch wide channel and doing like a hardwood, maybe like a walnut inlay or something to create a little bit of contrast and mask those seams. But they actually liked it just the simple plywood, and the wood putty did match it pretty good, so you don't really see it unless you're looking up close. But I did consider those other options. The other tricky decision was whether or not to have fewer seams on the top. Like I could have used the middle layer as the top layer and there just would have been that one seam, but it wouldn't have been symmetrical. And normally that doesn't bother me, but for this one it just seemed a little bit weird. So we went with the symmetrical kind of cruciform design. Now I also considered doing an all wood table, but everything that I sketched out didn't seem to justify the price the way the steel and the wood do. And that's not because the steel is expensive or adding value. It's more that the steel gives me, with my limited skill set, a lot more design flexibility. To do something with kind of dynamic angles like that out of wood would be way more time consuming relative to the tools and experiences that I have. But with welding, I can just, use my $400 welder and a $45 angle grinder and just like keep working until I get it the way to look that I want. So steel is actually surprisingly flexible, even if you're just kind of at an intermediary level. So like I'm not as good of a woodworker as say my good friend Chris Salamone from Four Eyes Furniture. I'm sure he would do an amazing like all wood table even at this size and scale. But I'm more of a designer, so it was really about trying to find or trying to pick the right materials that would let that design ability kind of shine more than the craftsmanship itself. The other cool thing about this particular combination of materials, plywood and steel, is that I didn't need expensive tools to accomplish this. In fact, all of the tools that I used for this project, you could buy them all new for less than $1,000. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Check out our other projects and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. All right, thanks. Bye.